Good morning. This morning we begin a brand new season of Bible stories in something called the Narrative Lectionary, which is simply a schedule of readings from the Bible that lasts for 4 years. And each year of the series begins in September and ends with Pentecost. And each year takes us through the Bible from beginning to end with selected stories, of course. This will be the year of Luke, so beginning at Christmas time and for a couple of months we'll be hearing the stories of Jesus' life and ministry as told through the lens of Luke. I love this narrative lectionary because instead of feeling as if we're getting a potpourri of unrelated stories throughout the year, we can see the arc of the salvation story of God's great love story for all of creation. And so we begin at the beginning. The story that we heard this morning is the second of 2 creation stories in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And when I think about how these stories came to be, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, what I imagine, and I invite you to imagine it with me, is cave people sitting around a campfire at night, looking at the stars and the moon and experiencing the changes in temperature and rain and snow and not understanding any of it. And I imagine them sitting there as campers always do, telling stories, wondering about where those twinkly things in the sky came from and life and death and all the complexity of what life looks like. And so we know as human beings that one of the things that separates us from other animals is our desire to understand things, our desire to make meaning out of our lives and our relationships. And that's exactly what is happening in this creation story. Here in this story, notice that the first thing that God makes is the man. And he makes him out of the earth. And later, of course, he makes a woman out of man's rib. But if you listen to the story, what you heard was that every part of creation was made from the same material. It was all made from God digging his hands down into the earth like a potter and molding and shaping what only God could imagine. And notice also that when Adam or Adam is first created, he's not even alive. He's a dirt man. And it isn't until God breathes his own breath of life into Adam's lungs that he suddenly becomes a living being. We see in this story that Adam and his wife, who is later named Eve, are given to each other out of God's recognition that it is not good for us to be lonely. And that tells us something about God, that perhaps God knows what loneliness feels like, and it is not good. In those beautiful words that Adam says when he first lays eyes on Eve, "Ah, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." We see that moment that we have experienced at various points in our lives, that moment of recognition. Not only is she gorgeous and made just for him, but he recognizes her as different from every other creature. He recognizes that there is something unique and deeply connected between him and her. And we see the vulnerability that they are willing to act out with each other when the text ends by telling us that they were both naked and were not ashamed. It's not until much later when they disobey God and realize that they have done something wrong that shame enters into their experience and they end up clothing themselves. But we get a little bit ahead of ourselves there. And so what we might understand that this text is telling us, that the people who originally conceived of this idea of how creation came to be understood what was really important in this crazy life we live, is that even back then that they understood and experienced the power of human relationship, of being loved lavishly just as God loves us. And we can see that Adam and his wife are, in fact, not so much a story about the first man and the first woman, but rather a story about you and about me, a story about the human condition. God places boundaries at the same time that God says to the man and the woman, you see all of this? Do you see all of this beauty? It's all yours to enjoy and to care for. But you may not eat, you may not touch the tree in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat it or touch it, you will die. And we know what happens. The very thing that God tells them they cannot do, should not do, because there will be huge consequences, is the only thing they want. If you've ever known a 2-year-old, you know exactly what's going on here. A child's first word that they learn is often the word no. And boy, do they use that word. Because as human beings, there's something within us that moves us to push against any boundaries or rules that we are given. And because God gives us the gift of free will to make our own choices, our own decisions about everything in our lives, we often find ourselves living in a tension between what we know we should or shouldn't do and what we really want to do. And so there's this part of being human that is being conflicted, longing for the abundant life in the garden, in paradise, abundant life that you and I now know comes to us only and most fully through our relationship with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. And yet at the same time that that's exactly what we want, what will fill us to overflowing with meaning and purpose and comfort and deep satisfaction, at the same time, we insist on our own destiny, on determining our own lives, even if it goes against everything that God has shown us and given us and said to us. And so that, in essence, is life in a broken world. And so I want to briefly talk about the two most important parts of this text for us today. The first is connectedness. Notice that God, human beings, and creation are all made from the same material. That earth, that deep, black, rich humus. And in the midst of those interconnections, interdependencies, joy is found. Now also notice this, because God gives the human beings free will, God is making God's self incredibly vulnerable. Think about it. God creates everything that is, creates human beings in God's own image, and says, I love you. I've given you everything you need to have a perfect and beautiful life. I love you. Now, if God were to be like a puppeteer and us as marionettes, then when God says, I love you, love me back, we would say, I love you. But that's not really love, is it? Love cannot be forced. It cannot be coerced. Anybody who's ever written a love note and passed it to a boy or a girl in 5th grade knows exactly what that vulnerability feels like. But like a good parent who loves unconditionally, God gives them and gives us the choice as to how we will respond to God's invitation to abundant life through a relationship with Him. And as we see throughout the salvation story, and even today, our insistence on going our own way, our insistence on determining our own futures and our own lives often move us to say no thank you to God for a moment or a period of time or a season of our lives. And it's in those times when we have turned our back on God that we find ourselves separated from the very source of life. Where we want to be like this, we find ourselves like this. And we wonder, where did God go? And the answer is, God never moved. The second quick point I want to make about this text is that other voice, that serpent, that voice that seduces the man and the woman to trust his promises. And if they're going to trust his promises, then they have to mistrust God's promises. When the serpent comes to the woman and says, "Did God say you may not eat of any tree in the garden?" And the woman says, "Well, no, we can have whatever we want, but just that tree we can't have, or we will die." And the serpent's response is, "You will not die. God is lying to you." And so they're faced with a choice. Who do they trust? Do they trust the voice, the instruction, the love of the creator of the universe? Or do they trust this other voice that promises them something? Knowledge of good and evil. Something that is there, like low-hanging fruit on a tree. Something they want, and yet it's the very thing that God knows will destroy them. And we all know the story, don't we? The liar taps into their desire for control, even if it means giving up paradise. And they take the fruit, and their eyes are opened, and they see that they are naked, and they clothe themselves, and they hide from God. And sin enters human experience. And so what this story does is it demonstrates to us that sin is not all those little big and small things that we do wrong each and every day. That sin is, in fact, separation from God. And what causes it? Our disobedience, our rebellion, our misplaced trust. It's the human condition. And so when God saw what humanity did with this gift of life and relationship, God had a choice: to destroy us or to choose life for us. And in Jesus, we see the fullness of that decision that God made. If we picture two mountain edges and a chasm, a big dip in between, and we think of God standing on one, calling out to us, and us on the other, wanting to connect with God, wanting that life that God offers us, and yet that chasm, which is caused by our sin, our separation, is just looming. We can't cross that. It's just too far. It's too deep. It's too wide. And then along comes Jesus, who on the cross forms a bridge for us that bridges that chasm so that we can go from deadness to life in the heart of the one who loves us. The salvation story is a story about the human condition and a God who loves us no matter what, who loves us through it all. Creation and redemption the steps that God took in Jesus to buy us back from where our sin had taken us, are both aspects of a God who stands with us, who weeps with us, who died for us, and who promises that he will never, ever let us go. I hope you'll join me again next week for our next salvation story as we look at the promises, the very unlikely promises that God made to Abraham and Sarah, and how those promises that God made come true changed everything forever. Thanks be to God. Amen.